Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this panel on rising coups in Africa, the road ahead. On September 14, 1960, a young colonel named Joseph Désiré Mobutu staged a coup in then Leopoldville in the Republic of Congo, now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo. He deposed President Joseph Kasavubu and Prime Minister Lumumba. He claimed that that was not a coup, but rather a peaceful revolution. That event 63 years ago set Congo on the course that we all know today. Lumumba will be killed 4 months later on January 17, 1961 in Katanga. This coup will herald a series of coups that will follow through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. Africa will see a respite, or if you want a break in coups, a respite, during the years, the 90s and the 2000s. We thought the page had been turned, especially following what was known in the Francophone space as the Conférence Nationale. But were we mistaken? Were there other conditions that we did not foresee? Today, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this discussion. My name is Mvemba Pezo Dizolele. I'm a senior fellow and the director of the Africa Program for Strategic and International Studies. We have aligned a very distinguished panel for us today, which I will introduce, to dissect these issues. We know that coups trigger strong emotions, strong reactions across the entire spectrum. To some, coups are terrible, they should never happen ever. To some, coups are happening because conditions are there to allow them to happen. So today I would like to welcome Kamisa Kamara, who is a senior advisor for Africa at the U.S. Institute of Peace here in Washington. She is a sub-Saharan Africa policy analyst and practitioner with 15 years of professional experience. She served as Mali's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Digital Economy and Planning, and most recently, Chief of Staff to the President of Mali, the late President of Mali, Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, who was overthrown in 2020 by Colonel Assimi Koïta, who's now head of the military government in Mali. We are also joined by Beverly Ochieng, who's a senior journalist and Africa analyst with BBC Monitoring. She focuses on insurgencies in West Africa, the Wagner Group involvement in parts of Africa, and political development across the continent. Jeffrey Smith is the executive director of Vanguard Africa. He has over a decade of experience in human rights advocacy, pro-democracy, and research on Africa, including at Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, Freedom House, the National Endowment for Democracy, and the Institute of Democratic Alternatives in South Africa, as well as UNESCO. Gilles Yabi is the founder and CEO of WATHI, the West Africa Citizen Think Tank, which launched in 2015. WATHI is a unique participative and multidisciplinary citizen-focused think tank on West African issues. Gilles worked as senior political analyst and later as West Africa project director at the International Crisis Groups. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Let's start with the questions that have kept us going for a while now. Why are these coups happening? What are the conditions setting them? What reaction do we get from the international community? Are these reactions even adequate? So, Kamisa, I will turn to you. Please make your remark, and then we go to the rest of the panel. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Mvemba, for the invitation, and thank you to CSIS for hosting this very important discussion. I will start by saying that, while reiterating what Mvemba just said, he did say that the military coups do trigger strong reactions. And they do also trigger waves of interrogations, conspiracy theories, widespread anxieties as to the type of instability that they can create. And that is because military coups are shocks to political systems, sometimes of countries that were closely monitored for years. And so this sudden upheaval leaves us grappling with questions of whether these military coups were predictable, or more often how we didn't see it coming. And so I believe that the international community, the media, sometimes even scholars may give the impression that all is well within a particular nation. And one clear example of that is the situation in Mali in 2012, when Mali had this its military coup in 2012. As scholars, policy makers, and observers of the Malian scene all came out very surprised and shocked. And there were headlines like, "The Mali is a beacon of democracy gone dark." Well, who told you that Mali was a beacon of democracy? Certainly, there was this veneer of stability that was perpetuated by the international partners of Mali. And so beneath this veneer, multiple challenges might be brewing. And at the heart of many coups lie the fraying or outright breaking of the social contract between a government and its citizens. And so when governments neglect, marginalize, oppress significant portions of their populations, or are faced with the impossible task of fulfilling the demands of a growing population for public services, but at the same time tackling a jihadist insurgency that can create fertile ground for upheaval. And so while we may spot these cracks and predict that they will potentially lead to instability, the role of the military in exploiting or mending these cracks is often not interrogated. And so historically, across many nations in Africa, the military has been seen not just as a defense force against external threats, but also as a guardian of national stability. And so in many African countries, post-independence narratives often positioned the military as saviors, as protectors of sovereignty, and even as nation builders. But over time, this view has given military leaders a sense of both responsibility and entitlement to step in when they perceive that the nation is at risk. And so while internal dynamics play a huge role, it's also crucial to acknowledge that there are external influences that sometimes embolden military interventions. From Cold War proxy battles to modern day geopolitics and arms sales, external actors have at times inadvertently or directly given military leaders the belief that they sort of have a green light, or at the very least that they'll face little to no consequences should they seize power. And so as we delve into this topic today, it's essential to approach this issue of military coups in Africa with a nuanced lens, rather than just asking how to prevent military coups. And we've been asking ourselves that question for close to 60 years now, and clearly we still don't have an answer. So that might mean that this is not the right question that needs to be asked. And what I'm going to say is very controversial, but we may seek to accept that military leaders have become political actors. And as such, we need to understand their deeper motivations, their histories, their influences, in order to work with them in a rule-based world. And I realize that I just said two completely opposite concepts. A military coup is an illegal seizure of power. A rule-based society is based on rules. Well, when important actors break the rules, we need to understand why they do so. We need to understand why it's so easy for them to do so, but we also need to understand why citizens are accepting of them breaching the rule. And so in conclusion, as we grapple with the phenomenon of coups, it's incumbent upon us to move beyond surface level explanations by deeply understanding the interplay between local dynamics, the role of the military, and external influences. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamisa. I just want to follow up quickly on that. And I think this is part of the challenge that African countries, or any country, really, any polity faces. You said the military may have become political actors, but I will contend that they've always been political actors. They are citizens like anybody else. Having served in the military, I know that I was always a citizen, even when I was under the flag, as we say. So as such, while some of the engagements are mitigated, they are full citizens of the country. They suffer the same socioeconomic hardship or political turbulence that everybody else suffers in the country. So is there perhaps time for us to start reconsidering? You mentioned the role of the military. A lot of the militaries in Africa still carry the colonial DNA. They were created to subjugate the local population, not to uphold the social contract. So just something to keep in mind as we move forward in our discussion, because I think that piece has been missing. If the political system is not working and the civilians are not delivering, they're not just delivering for the civilian, they're also not delivering for the military. So it becomes a problem when the guardians of the republic, so to speak, of the sovereignty of the country, which are both the civilians and the military, if one part of it is not being served, the entire chain is not being served. So sometimes it's very challenging to ask one part of this, one segment of that society, that citizenry, to say you don't have your grievances, we're going to handle them differently. So just something to keep in mind. Beverly, on to you.
I mean, I feel like I agree with quite a lot of what you've said and what Kamisa was saying, and it's from observing even just the recent wave of coups. And I think over the last 4 or 5 years, one of the things that's been happening, stretching from Sudan to Guinea, and now we have Gabon, is whether democracy has failed or it is in retreat, and whether military seizures of power, as Kamisa was pointing out, are a means of resetting broken systems, because armies are supposed to provide security, not just towards external forces, but also internally, as we're seeing, and to protect public institutions. In Sudan, when it happened in 2019, it was after weeks of protests over the rising cost of bread, which then morphed into anger over the lengthy stay of the authoritarian president, Omar al-Bashir. And then in Mali in 2020, it was after those legislative elections where there was a prominent opposition leader who was kidnapped by al-Qaeda militants during campaigns. And there was socio-economic pressure as a result of those insurgencies. And then another coup, of course, when the military rulers themselves were not happy with the transitional government. And that was more of a selfish cause in a way. In Chad, the coup happened as a way of protecting the status quo after Idris Deby suddenly died while fighting rebels, and these rebels were a threat to the transition. So his son, Mahamat, seemed like a palatable choice, even though it wasn't democratic. And then you had later on in Guinea, which was a very belated coup, because we'd seen the protests in 2019. We'd seen President Alpha Conde change the constitution, run for presidency again, win that election, and the public discontent as a result of that. Burkina Faso, the security situation. Niger was a bit of an odd one, because I suppose in my perception, it could have happened earlier, which is a terrible thing to say, but it happened because the security forces were protecting themselves from scrutiny when there were questions about the defense budget, but it's a country with an insurgency. And in Gabon, it was a way of removing someone, a family that has been there for a long time. So we see that in all these instances, military elites or disgruntled soldiers have taken advantage of political disquiet to give themselves power. And this has, in the majority of cases, been met with some euphoria, because it feels like they're taking back and being able to restore certain institutions, because people are tired of civilian elites, unresponsive democratic institutions. And whether it's, electoral commissions or the judiciary, or even the frustration about social and economic mobility that is not quite meeting what people expect. And these young populations who are quite disgruntled by that. It doesn't legitimize the coups, but it underpins that. And so several of these coups have taken place on the back of mass protests or anger towards the government, but they haven't provided solutions. So in Mali, for instance, violence has been fourfold between 2020 and now. They have tried to change their defense partners, because there has also been anger at international partners, whether it's regional states like the ECOWAS bloc, or even if you're looking at the G5 Sahel force, which has essentially broken down. And then now you have the French forces who've been forced to leave. And then you're looking at places like Guinea, where the military or Mamadou Doumbouya came in waxing lyrical about changing the constitution, about representing people, but he has held on to power and not been held adequately accountable by those institutions that are supposed to ensure that there is a democratic transition. In Chad, there was the extension of military rule by 2 years, and we still see Mahamat is very close to the US, very close to France. So, there's the questions about which coups have been seen as acceptable, which ones are seen as being destabilizing. But ultimately, what we are seeing is there is some degradation of democratic institutions. Media freedoms are also, being eroded. We're not sure if elections are going to take place in many of these countries to make sure that there's a handover of power to civilian rule. And then at some point, you find that even those who are supporting those juntas, like in Mali today, there was this activist who had been backing the junta through and through in the public, in the radio, on various platforms. And now he's also being charged with undermining the state. So when these militaries take power, change institutions, maybe change the laws, like have referenda or change the electoral code, and there's a lack of external accountability, it becomes a problem and it feeds into itself. So we find that more militaries might be emboldened to reset democratic institutions by seizing power, because they are also a center of power, which could be in competition with democratic institutions, with leaders who have been elected, as we're seeing in many of these cases.
Thank you very much, Beverly. From what you say, I think we go back to that coup on 14 September 1916 in Congo. Coups typically reset the system, or at least the real world of experience that is happening. In the 60s, the 70s, coups were also couched in what Kamisa just mentioned, the geopolitics of the time, Cold War and so on. But then we went to this period in the 90s, particularly to the Conférence Nationale. Kenya experienced this. Benin was the leader of this kind of process. Zambia was right front and center. Have we failed somewhere? It looks like we failed somewhere. The talks of the democracy, the several election cycle that we've seen, I would like to revisit that again when we get into our discussion. Now I'll turn to Jeffrey Smith.
Great. Thank you so much. I think obviously the first day of a coup is always the happiest, most euphoric day, as Beverly was just discussing. But then, of course, the reality quickly sets in, and people are always asked, or forced to ask themselves, rather, are we getting something better, or simply trading one oppressor for another? And I think with that framing, there are some key issues for me and some misperceptions that I think we should address at the outset. Number one, I've seen the argument made frequently that the coup in Gabon and the 9 others or 7 others, depending on whom you talk to in the region since 2020, were caused by a failure of democracy. I completely reject that notion, because number two, sham elections rigged by autocrats do not equal democracy. I think the meaning of democracy in this way has been warped and is rightly being called into question by those who have experienced plenty of elections or electoral processes, but little in the way of real political choice or accountability. And then the third related issue is that military coups, even if they oust a longtime dictator, they rarely usher in democracy. And we can get into a bit more of that later on. But number 4, I don't think we shouldn't confuse coups for popular uprisings, right? They are vastly different, and the latter has a much better success rate at ushering in genuine democracy as opposed to the latter. And number 5, and something I think we need to insert into this conversation, is that we must not accept the charade that today's coup leaders represent the people. And in so doing, I think we need to push back against this idea that democracy is somehow a Trojan horse for neocolonialism or part of some nefarious Western agenda. To me, it's both misleading and also patronizing to suggest that democracy has been imposed when in fact we all know that it has been demanded and fought for from below for generations now. So the broader context, and I think, is this: it's despite what many people have assumed, especially on social media, which I'm sure all of us have seen, is that coups are not backed by popular demand, nor are they embraced by citizen populations. I was this week in a very fascinating briefing by Afrobarometer, which I'm sure many listeners are familiar with, and their latest survey data, and it showed that 2/3 of Africans say they want democracy and 67% disapprove of military rule. But to Kamisa's point, there are serious red flags. Only 44% of Africans say elections enable voters to remove leaders that voters do not want. So there really is this prevailing sense of marginalization, of disillusionment and dissatisfaction. And there's a fundamental problem of governance quality, what I would call the supply side of democracy. So I think we can't deny that coups sometimes represent a glimmer of hope, albeit fleeting, for masses living under dictatorship. And this is why, again, according to Afrobarometer's latest data, a slim majority, actually 53%, are willing to endorse military intervention if elected leaders abuse their power, particularly amongst the youth population ages 18 to 35. And we recently had a blog post published over at Vanguard Africa written by Togolese activist Farida Nabarima, and I think she summed this up really nicely, and I'm just going to read it. She wrote, the term democracy has been co-opted by political gangsters who have come to power through corruption, manipulation of institutions, voter suppression, ballot stuffing, and violence against the people. And I think that's something we really need to consider. But the other issue I would really like to insert into this conversation today is for me, a big elephant in the room. And that's the fact that we need to confront the reality that despots and dictators have routinely gotten away with sham elections, or electoral coups, in other words, as the recent charades just this year in Sierra Leone, in Zimbabwe, and Gabon so visibly illustrate. And I think there's much blame to go around, including a generation of African leaders who have not lived up to the standards that they themselves have drafted, have signed, and have ratified through multiple regional and international conventions. But sitting here next to Washington, I think we have to look inward as well. I think Washington has been woefully ineffective and inconsistent in their responses to coups in various forms, whether they are electoral, constitutional, or military. And again, to Kamisa's point, there's a much more permissive environment today than there was several years ago. If you look at the spate of recent coups, a common theme in each of them has been emboldened militaries realizing that they are likely to face little to no resistance for their actions. And this wasn't always the case. Washington used to place pretty big consequences on coup leaders. If you go back to the coup in Mauritania in 2008, in Guinea in 2009, following the Stadium massacre, in Mali after the coup in 2012, in Guinea-Bissau and CAR in 2012 as well. But that pressure now is mostly gone. But there's also been no explanation for this departure from precedent. Of course, this is not to say that these actions will prevent coups. They will not. But it certainly increases the pressures on would-be coup plotters by making them think twice about their actions. And I think likewise, under both Republican and Democratic administrations, this is a bipartisan issue. There has been a failure to address, again, the rising instances of electoral coups, what I would call the soft bigotry of low expectations. And why does this matter? Why do I keep bringing this up? And it's because electoral coups often lead to military coups down the line. You look at Zimbabwe, a stolen election in 2008. You have a coup in 2017. Guinea, you have what many people would argue was a stolen election in 2020, a coup in 2021. And most recently, Gabon, of course, a brazenly rigged election in 2016, again in 2023, and a coup several months later, or immediately thereafter, rather. In some, I would say, unfortunately, the U.S. government appears untroubled by the notion that elections that would not pass muster in the major powers or even here are somehow acceptable in Africa. And I think this is, number one, highly disrespectful and obviously an unsustainable path to continue down. And just really quickly to close out, I think in light of these current realities, we have to ask what can be done instead of just admiring these problems. What are some of the potential solutions that I'm sure we'll get into a bit more later? But what I think we can do first and foremost is empower the masses, average citizens, civil society, the democratic opposition, leaders in the diaspora, those living in exile, to take advantage of any opportunity. And this includes coups, to rise up peacefully and to demand dignity, to build institutions that safeguard the fundamental tenets of democracy that have been lacking. And I think this can be accomplished by building up institutions, both social and political, because to be strong, of course, government effectiveness must grow in strength alongside citizen power. So along with that, we must help to enhance the capabilities of political institutions, legislatures, judiciaries, the independent media. And of course, I think first and foremost, independent electoral commissions that are properly equipped and supported to enhance citizens' trust and legitimacy of electoral outcomes. And just to wrap up, I think African leaders, but also their development partners and supporters worldwide, who have really let the continent down if the trail forward is merely posed as this false choice between military coups or rigged elections. And I think I think we'd be making a really grave mistake if we write off the importance of democracy while remaining flippant and passive about democratic governance and all that entails for stability and quality of life. Because we know that the longing for democracy is poignant. The quest stretches across 6 decades now. And empirical evidence, as I mentioned with Afrobarometer and other polling data, is clear. When Africans have a voice, they choose democratic governance over every other option, including one man and military rule. So the evidence is overwhelming, and despite the anecdotes, the disinformation, the propaganda we see daily on social media, if we can work on the supply side of democracy, again, on that supply side of democracy, and also unapologetically support democratic leadership, I think that is where the solution should be.
Thank you, Jeffrey. A couple of things that I want to raise with you to think about is this gap, of course, between the promotion of democracy, quote unquote, and what's happening on the ground. We've worked with democratic institutions for a long time. We've observed elections. We've seen people mobilize. Yeah, we've been told military coups are bad. Do not rally around them. We see more and more the youth actually rallying around those things. The piece you mentioned by Farida Nabureima talk about the misunderstanding of African youth, not understanding them exactly where the needs are. We are told civilians should mobilize and they can then vanquish dictatorship. A great example has been Sudan. We've seen the Sudanese people, rural, urban, youth, professional, everybody mobilize in a way we've not seen in any African country, really. And that has failed. Are there double standards? If this had been in Poland, this had been in Ukraine, this had been in the Czech Republic, or wherever else, the West, the donors put a lot of funds into this process. And often these things lead to some good outcome. We've not seen that level of support in Africa. And then we see the condemnation 50 years, 60 years later, African countries across the board are still waiting for that day. Not that they're not mobilizing, they've been mobilizing, and then they face this incoherence from the Western partners. We see this in the messaging and so on. So something for you to think about as we go to the next round. Gilles, welcome, and on to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mvemba and CISIS for this invitation. I think I could just say, well, thank you. They said it all, because I think the three predecessors were extremely clear, and I think they almost said it all. But I guess that it would be too easy for me just to to say that. I have nothing to add, so I will add maybe a few thoughts. I think. The first is this, of course, a lot of comment about the spate of coup, even the contagion, the epidemic of coup d'etat on the continent. And I think that it might limit the perception of the diversity of political situation that we are talking about. And I think Beverly made it very clear by talking in detail about different situations. I think it's very different to talk about Sudan, for example, where you have a long history of authoritarian and military rule, and actually it is a fight for first real democratic government to happen in the country. It's very different from the situation in Mali or Burkina Faso in the Sahel. And even if you take Guinea, it is also a different combination of factors that I think explain the coup d'etat. So I think it is very important really to keep in mind that all African countries, as you know, all countries in the world, have their own political history, their own political trajectory, and that is the main determinants, explanation of what is happening at one point. And when we have coup, we have to look at those very national and local factors. At the same time, yes, there is a possible contagion, which is basically the signal which is given to military officers when you are coup in 2 or 3 countries. Well, you know that it is possible. You know the kind of reaction that you can get, and you know that actually it can work. And if you know that you can have significant support from the population, it's always very difficult to evaluate that support. But I think it would be wrong to think that there is no popular support for some of the coups. So when the military officers get the signal that it is possible, internally, but also it is possible given international reaction and given the current geopolitical context, then yes, definitely a coup in one country can also trigger passage à l'acte, I would say in French, action in other countries. Second point is that I think what the countries have in common, and that's actually, of course, something worrying because I think it means that we can have more coups over signs of political instability in other countries on the continent. Because I think what they share is this political trajectory of being young states. I think it is very important, especially for international audience, to just clarify the fact that we are talking about countries that have 60, 70 years as independent states in their current borders. And that has a lot of implication of what was the challenge of building states, building democratic state, which is not the same thing, in my opinion, building nations, building societies, diverse societies, understanding that they belong to a single nation state or single kind of political institution. That was a huge challenge. And I think that the fact that Mvemba mentioned the coup in Congo was very interesting because, of course, back to what happened in Congo, you can see the combination of internal factors, legacy of colonialism, but also the fact that you have people with ambitions and you have external factors as well, especially when we are talking about countries that have a lot of resources. You cannot talk about Gabon, for example, the history of Gabon, without talking about the resources of Gabon, without talking about how, from the very beginning, France decided to select the kind of leadership that you wanted to secure access to the resources of Gabon. So again, there are a lot of commonalities that make it actually possible to have a lot of fragility in other countries that are not actually experiencing coup d'etat now. The third thing is, I think Jeffrey rightly clarified that it is very important. I fully agree with him. The comment that about failure of democracy, I think, is totally wrong because, it's probably a failure to implement real democracy. So we cannot say that democracy failed when you do not have democracy in these countries. And I think it is very important to clarify that because what I think people are saying in these countries by applauding coup is that they are not happy with the way the countries have been managed. And they are not happy with the economic and social conditions they are living in. It's not a theoretical debate about democracy. It is an issue of people who are not satisfied with the state of a country. And I think the challenges of the problem is that the states, the economic situation now in any country of the continent is not the result of the last 5 years. It is the result of the last 2 or 3 decades. And that's where you have a real problem because the youth are not satisfied with the conditions. But of course, they can't necessarily understand that you don't have quick fix to that. You won't have a significant improvement of economic and social conditions in just a few years. Even with a very good government, you won't get that. And that, I think, one of the reason why we need to really to work a lot in terms of explaining also the fact that, coup can only aggravate economic and social conditions that are actually one of the main reasons why people are applauding coups. And the final observation is the distinction on the issue of building democracy and building efficient states. I think that we cannot be worried only about democracy. I'm a strong supporter of democracy, but we have to talk about the economy. We have to talk about strategic interests. We have to talk about the foreign policy of democratic states. And the foreign policy of the US or France or over state, I can see really a lot of democratic components in these foreign policies, and they have an impact also on the current situation on many countries of the continent. So my point is that I think we really need to work on the issue of building strong democracy, but also building efficient state, because we need public policies, and countries that are not democratic, like China, for example, and a few others, at least we are providing something to the citizen in terms of security, in terms of economic and social goods. And I think that, again, the challenge on the continent is not only building democratic states, it's also about building efficient states that produce results for the people. So I would stop here.